On a quiet Thursday morning, Charles Spencer did something that 3 decades of carefully managed palace public relations never could. He produced a single piece of paper that proved the story the world had been told about. Princess Diana and Princess Anne was not just slightly off or missing a few details. It was the complete opposite of what actually happened. And the way this revelation surfaced is nearly as compelling as what the letter itself contains. The timing, the precise mechanics of how it was delivered to the public, the fact that there are reportedly 2 copies of this document locked away in separate vaults in different corners of England. None of that happened by chance. This was a deliberately coordinated release. And the palace's own legal team apparently pulled an all-night session trying to find a way to block it, only to realize they had no legal standing whatsoever to intervene. So let's begin with the box, because the imagery of this moment is genuinely cinematic. Charles Spencer is seated in the library at Althorpe House, the Spencer family's ancestral estate in Northamptonshire. If you've ever seen photographs of this room, it looks precisely how you'd picture an English aristocratic library. Tall windows, thousands of leather-bound volumes, that particular quality of morning light that makes the whole scene feel like something out of a period film. He's at a heavy walnut desk, and in front of him sits a mahogany box that had just been retrieved from a secure vault built directly beneath the foundation stones of the mansion, not a filing cabinet in a basement. An actual vault under the foundation. He slips on white cotton archivist gloves, a detail that matters because it signals this is not some casual family photo album being opened. This is full document preservation protocol. He produces an iron key, turns it in a brass lock, and inside the box, which is lined with aged blue silk, rests a single sheet of light blue writing paper. The date at the top reads August 10th, 1997. If you know your timeline, that is exactly 21 days before Diana was killed in Paris. That date alone shifts the gravity of every single word written on that page. Before we go further, if you're finding this breakdown valuable and want more royal family analysis, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and come along with us here at Royal Exposure. We're following these stories as they unfold, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, the letter itself. The paper carries the embossed red Kensington Palace crest at the top, and it's filled with Diana's unmistakable handwriting in black rollerball pen. And Charles Spencer didn't simply stumble onto this and immediately call a press conference. He spent 2 full days working alongside a senior forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives to confirm that the signature was genuine before he uttered a single word in public. They analyzed ink pressure points and consistency against hundreds of verified letters housed in the Spencer family's own repository, and the conclusion that came back that morning was absolute. This is Diana's handwriting, Diana's words, Diana's signature. There is no room for doubt. What she actually wrote is where this story takes apart everything we believed about the dynamic between these 2 women. For 30 years, the accepted narrative, pushed by royal biographers and the press alike, was that Diana and Anne were essentially rivals. The framing was always the same. Diana was the glamorous, emotionally open, media-savvy celebrity princess, and Anne was the stern, traditional, rural, charity-driven royal who had no patience for any of it. The assumption was that they kept their distance from each other behind closed doors and shared nothing in common. This letter demonstrates that during the bleakest stretch of her marital separation, when most of the aristocracy had already distanced themselves from her, Diana turned to Anne as her main source of guidance and protection. Not a friend from her social circle, not a celebrity confidant, the king's sister, and the way she addressed her reveals exactly how close they truly were. Diana didn't use formal aristocratic titles. She addressed Anne simply as Anne, with an intimacy that apparently laid bare how vulnerable she was during the summer of 1997. The letter lays out her mounting fear about the rigid institutional protocols that senior courtiers were using to control the public profiles of her 2 sons, William and Harry. She wrote that she felt a desperate need to construct a permanent, independent, protective shield around the emotional development of her boys. And she believed Anne was the only person in the entire Windsor household who had the sheer courage to stand up to the palace bureaucracy. Stop and think about what that means. Diana looked at every single person in that family and concluded that the one individual who would genuinely fight for her children was the woman the press kept describing as cold and aloof. Now, the logistics behind how this letter was delivered are genuinely fascinating because Diana didn't simply drop it in the regular post at Kensington Palace. She knew that the central palace machinery was actively monitoring her correspondence during this period. So she used what's being described as a highly secretive, informal postal network that younger aristocrats relied on to bypass senior courtiers entirely. She directed her most trusted personal chauffeur to drive the envelope straight to the equestrian stables at Gatcombe Park, Anne's private estate, and deliver it by hand to Anne's head groom under strict instructions of absolute confidentiality. This was not mailed. It was not sent through any official channel. It was physically driven to the stables by someone Diana trusted without question. And from there, it went directly to Anne's desk. The palace screening apparatus never came near it. Charles Spencer reportedly gave Clarence House advance notice before this went public. His legal team delivered a high-resolution photocopy of the document to the king's private secretary on Wednesday afternoon as a formal courtesy, giving them a window to review the text before the announcement. And the arrival of that folder set off what's being described as frantic activity inside the palace legal department. Senior solicitors spent the entire night examining the 1993 Royal Trust Acts to determine whether the Crown had any statutory basis to file an injunction blocking publication. They ultimately concluded that because the original physical letter was discovered in the private archives of Althorp House, and because it was addressed to a private individual rather than a state official, the Crown had no constitutional authority whatsoever to suppress it. It was an independent historical artifact that fell entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Official Secrets Act or the Royal Collection Trust. The palace lawyers essentially had to inform the king's advisors, "There is nothing we can do, this is going forward." So, what was in the letter that sent the palace legal team into that kind of scramble? Diana wrote that she had obtained a specific administrative document through a trusted source inside the palace registry office just 48 hours before she sat down to write to Anne. That leaked document outlined a confidential plan by senior court officials to systematically restructure her global security arrangements and reduce her personal protection detail to a bare minimum, all designed to pressure her into surrendering her independent media operations. She used the phrase administrative trap explicitly to describe the legal mechanisms being prepared by the king's solicitors. She explained that the ultimate objective was to invoke an ancient clause within the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a private custody dispute asserting the sovereign's overriding prerogative to control the education, residence, and daily movements of William and Harry. That is not a vague anxiety. That is a specific legal strategy she had obtained details about, and her primary concern was not her own public standing or her travel arrangements. She wrote that her deepest fear was the cold institutional environment that would swallow her sons if she were suddenly removed from their daily lives. She described the senior advisors running the central household as a corporate board of directors who regarded the young princes as functional components of state machinery rather than developing human beings in need of genuine parental affection. That is a devastating characterization. And it becomes even more devastating when you realize she was writing it to the king's own sister, essentially saying your family's apparatus is going to emotionally destroy my children unless someone steps in. The appeal to Anne specifically is where the letter apparently becomes almost unbearable to read. Diana wrote that she was begging Anne to see past the superficial court gossip that had been deliberately manufactured to drive them apart over the previous decade. She said she chose Anne because Anne was the only member of the Windsor family who possessed the raw courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend the fundamental human rights of a mother. She wanted Anne to serve as an unyielding emotional wall between her boys and the traditionalists who sought to mold them into distant, unfeeling symbols of the state. The forensic examination of the original manuscript actually revealed that Diana spent several hours carefully crafting this warning. The reverse side of the page contains multiple corrections where she crossed out initial sentences and replaced them with more precise, legally binding language. She was ensuring that if this document was ever recovered during a future family crisis, palace attorneys could not dismiss it as an emotional outburst. She was constructing a legal record. But here's the detail that reportedly triggered a fresh wave of panic through Buckingham Palace on Thursday morning. In the middle of the second page, Diana referenced a secret personal repository containing more than 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and early marriage. She told Anne she had hidden this repository entirely outside the palace infrastructure, completely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And she instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to fully block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. So there is potentially a vault somewhere, possibly in Fleet Street, according to some reports, holding 200 documents that Diana specifically set aside as an insurance policy. The king's legal teams are reportedly working through the night, tracing the movement of Spencer family holdings from that era in an attempt to locate this vault before anything else surfaces. That is not a comfortable position for the palace to occupy. The letter closes with a postscript that Diana added just before sealing the envelope. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the next morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her window to secure her son's emotional safety was closing fast. 3 weeks later, she was gone. That postscript transforms this document from a piece of family correspondence into something that reads like a final testament. Now let's talk about Princess Anne's side of this, because what she did with this letter for 30 years is truly extraordinary. She kept her copy inside a fireproof, military-grade combination safe, bolted directly into the stone wall of her private study at Gatcombe Park, buried beneath layers of equestrian breeding logs and family land records. That safe remained completely untouched by any palace assistant or household surveyor for exactly 3 decades. Through every documentary, every memoir, every leaked tape recording sold to international broadcasters for millions of pounds, she gave 0 interviews. She authorized 0 press statements. She kept that letter locked away and said absolutely nothing. The structural realities of her royal role explain why. Anne has spent her entire adult life functioning as the foundational pillar of the crown's traditional infrastructure. Her primary loyalty is to the long-term continuity of the state, not to personal PR campaigns or media cycles. She understood that revealing a letter alleging an administrative conspiracy inside the palace would have triggered a massive constitutional crisis during the fragile transition period of the late 1990s. The public outrage would have completely derailed the stabilization of the monarchy and directly endangered the future reign of her nephew William. So rather than launching a public war against the palace advisors, Anne chose to carry the emotional weight of the letter in complete isolation and quietly carry out the protective role Diana had begged her to take on. And the court circular records actually support this. Between 1997 and 2005, Anne quietly recalibrated her official charity schedules to ensure she was consistently present at the Windsor estate during the boys' academic breaks. She didn't bring camera crews. She didn't invite royal correspondents. She simply arrived in her private car, spent hours walking with William and Harry along the quiet paths of the Great Park, and gave them a stable, grounded space entirely insulated from the PR maneuvering happening at Clarence House. While the tabloids were painting her as a cold traditionalist who was indifferent to the tragedy, Anne was being precisely the emotional barrier Diana had prayed for. She just never told anyone she was doing it. The tension over the secret finally reached a breaking point in 2026 when palace archivists began preparing for a major national milestone celebration. The master of the household requested a comprehensive audit of all private correspondence files at Gatcombe Park, intending to transfer any sensitive historical documents to the central repository at Windsor Castle, where they could be vetted and restricted under the 50-year rule of state privacy. Anne rejected the audit immediately. She informed the central registry clerks that her private safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow, and she refused to hand over the keys. The palace legal department recognized they had no statutory grounds to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private inheritance papers without sparking a highly damaging internal court battle. So they backed down. The coordination between Charles Spencer and Anne before the public announcement deserves attention. The Earl traveled to Gloucestershire by private car to hold an urgent private briefing with Anne inside her study. He informed her that his legal team had independently verified the original manuscript found in the Althorpe Library, and he believed the public interest demanded immediate publication to correct the false historical narrative. Anne listened in complete silence, her hands resting on the edge of her roll-top desk, and then gave her quiet, formal endorsement to proceed. She recognized that with the Althorp copy fully verified by forensic experts, any further effort to conceal the duplicate would look like a desperate palace cover-up. Later that afternoon, the safe was opened so her personal solicitors could cross-reference the text against the Althorp manuscript one final time. The duplicate light blue paper matched perfectly. The reaction inside Buckingham Palace when this went public was reportedly chaos. Over 300 separate administrative computers within the palace network simultaneously accessed the high-resolution digital scans uploaded from the Althorp press server. The standard workflow of scheduling diplomatic visits and drafting routine press releases ground to a complete halt. Senior media directors abandoned their morning tea to gather around the primary media monitoring wall, watching BBC News and Sky News correspondents stationed outside the palace gates, holding up early print editions with front-page headlines dissecting the phrase administrative trap that Diana had written 33 years ago. The strategic damage to the current court structure is significant. For years, the palace PR machinery framed the royal friction of the 1990s as a straightforward, tragic breakdown of a private marriage, pouring millions from the sovereign grant into projecting an image of modern, streamlined continuity. The revelation of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne completely dismantles that corporate narrative. Public polling showed an immediate, massive surge of sympathy for Anne, with over 80% of respondents praising her for carrying the emotional burden in total silence to protect the young princes. Meanwhile, public perception of the old administrative guard plummeted because the text explicitly portrayed the palace bureaucracy as a cold, controlling machine that prioritized institutional control over basic human compassion. This created an immediate operational crisis for the communications team because they had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning to promote Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances in London. After the viral explosion of the Althorp letter, the media directors realized that proceeding with fashion and lifestyle updates would come across as stunningly tone-deaf. While the public was absorbing a mother's final, desperate warning, the king's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule and locked the media assets back in the archive safe until the cultural storm settles. Then there's the phone call between the king's study at Clarence House and Prince William's private office at Adelaide Cottage. The king's advisors wanted to draft a joint family defense statement that would acknowledge the historical significance of the letter, while gently framing it as a relic of a bygone era of court tension. They wanted William to sign his name to a text, claiming the family had long since moved beyond the administrative conflicts of 1997. William rejected the palace script entirely during that 20-minute call. He informed his father's private secretary that he would not authorize his staff to participate in any PR campaign designed to minimize or spin his mother's original words. He stated that the handwritten note left by Charles Spencer was an authentic piece of his own family history, and he fully respected the absolute silence his Aunt Anne had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood. By refusing to back the central administration's defensive strategy, William effectively left the king's advisors isolated and exposed the central palace apparatus to the full force of public scrutiny. The afternoon shift at the palace press office tells you everything about how unprepared they were. Phones rang without pause as hundreds of international journalists demanded to know whether the Crown would launch a formal investigation into the secret repository mentioned in the text. The press secretaries had no answers. They could only read a repetitive, generic statement about the private nature of historical family papers, their voices cracking slightly under the pressure of a historical revelation that no amount of palace diplomacy could contain. The final administrative verification was stamped into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. A senior court archivist placed digital encryption codes over the newly processed file, cataloging it under the permanent national history logs. The original 1997 light blue Kensington Palace paper is now officially registered in the public archives of the state, housed in a secure, temperature-controlled archival box where it is protected from any future attempts at palace censorship or administrative modification. Outside the iron railings of Buckingham Palace, thousands of people stood in silence holding evening print editions featuring full-page replicas of Diana's sloping handwriting. The polling that evening showed over 90% of respondents expressing deep gratitude for the protection Anne had provided to the young princes. So where does this leave the modern court? King Charles's central administration is confronting a reality where 30 years of narrative management has been undone by a single sheet of paper from the Althorpe vault. The future court, led by William from Adelaide Cottage, has emerged completely insulated from the fallout because the public now recognizes that his modern style of leadership is directly aligned with the emotional blueprint his mother fought so hard to protect. The old guard of advisors has been forced into silence. And Princess Anne, the woman the tabloids spent decades painting as cold and distant, has been revealed as the person Diana trusted most to shield her children from the machinery of the institution itself. The voice from the past didn't just add a footnote to royal history, it completely rewrote the story we thought we knew.